Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show. It was a mark of maturity for mages to have their own magic system. It signified flawless technique in the use of magic as well as a thorough understanding of magic rules. It was an entirely different realm in itself, and meant that the mage was on their way to reaching the peak of their strength. Nobody knew where the end of this journey lay, nor did anyone know if there would be countless obstacles along the way, but one thing was certain: any mage who walked on this path was a truly powerful one in the field of magic. They were like ascetics trying to figure their way out alone on a path littered with unknowns. Nobody would be there to give them any guidance, nor would there be anyone with past experiences they could learn from. Everyone walked a different path, and their magic system belonged only to themselves. There was no way for anyone to emulate them, and even if they did, they would only fail trying. Even a mage like Anduin would never give Lin Li any advice on this, as he knew that it was a journey Lin Li had to embark on alone. It was up to him to scale the peak of magic. Of course, Lin Li did not disappoint him. He was only in his 20s, but already had his own magic system. This was definitely a rarity even in the whole of Amrel. Furthermore, Lin Li used 2 kinds of level 16 magic to support his magic system. He was probably the only one since the Dark Ages ended 1,300 years ago to be able to create 2 kinds of level 16 magic at once. This was no small feat, as the magic system Lin Li would have would be incredibly powerful since it was supported by 2 sorts of level 16 magic. Well, his starting point was already too advanced. Arcane combustion directly targeted mana, while countercurrent vortex targeted mental strength. Mana and mental strength were the 2 most essential elements of magic, so how powerful would a magic system created from these 2 be? Even the god of mages Juresco might not be able to predict the extent of Lin Li's future achievements had he come back to life. The campfire celebration only ended in the dead of the night. Lin Li had been silently sitting in his tent the whole time, repeating the events of the fight in his head. It seemed like Lin Li had nothing to do with the fight in the eyes of Jason and the rest, as they thought that Norfeller had won purely by his own means and rescued them from the ice howler. Nobody had paid any attention to the cowardly employer. This fellow had done nothing besides using 2 lowly kinds of magic before sitting beside the fire the whole time, not moving an inch even when Norfeller nearly died in the hands of the ice howler. Who would associate him the ice howler's death? Nobody would guess that this cowardly fellow, who seemed to have been a free rider the whole time, was actually the main contributor to the ice howler's death. He had neutralized the frost shock with an arcane combustion, and killed the ice howler with a countercurrent vortex. By using the 2 spells together, he changed the outcome of the fight completely. Honestly, even if Jason and the rest knew of this, they would find it hard to believe that this fellow had mastered such terrifying magic, what more be their creator. The principle behind arcane combustion was not complicated. To put it simply, one had to release a large amount of mana at once to form a dense field with it. Any magic that passed through the field would be strongly stimulated, which caused the magical elements to become more volatile. Once the stimulation was strong enough, it would create an evaporation effect and cause any magic to disappear immediately, just like the frost shock earlier. The countercurrent vortex was much more complicated, as it required an immensely strong mental strength as well as a thorough understanding of magical mantras. Only those who mastered the core magical mantras would be able to forcefully reverse the flow of magical elements. This was a meticulous and complicated process, and a tiny mistake could change the magic in unpredictable ways. Sometimes, even Lin Li did not know what would happen when he released a countercurrent vortex. Actually, Lin Li had already thought to create such magic back in Alana. He had enriched his knowledge of magic in the Omniscient Tower and learned a great deal of advanced spells. All the copying and emulating had given him ideas to create his own magic. It was just that Lin Li had not been equipped with the ability to do so then. The match in the Aurora Square came next. Lin Li suddenly obtained a dozen core magical mantras during the match. It was a windfall bestowed upon him by the heavens, as this was immeasurable wealth to any mage. All he needed to do was learn how to use this wealth, and he had spent his time in Black Cloud's town trying to master the core magical mantras. At the same time, his knowledge of magic and techniques of using magic had reached an unimaginable level. It was only natural that he started creating his own magic. Lin Li had only wanted to cause some trouble for his enemies, using a nearly unlimited amount of mana when he first created the arcane combustion, but after some tests, he slowly realized that instead of forcefully oppressing his opponents, he could give them a hand instead. By increasing the speed of release of their magic and forcing it past a certain threshold, he could create a brand of dusk effect and cause their magic to vanish. Of course, the two kinds of magic varied in nature as one accelerated the meltdown, while the other used a channel to redirect the magic. However, they both resulted in a similar outcome, which was basically to extinguish the effect of his opponent's magic. Moreover, the biggest advantage of the arcane combustion was that it worked regardless of his opponent's level. As long as Lin Li's mana was stronger, he could attempt to engulf their magic with arcane combustion, then, the countercurrent vortex. Quite honestly, more than half the credit for creating this magic went to Darien. He had slightly altered the inscription structure of the Aurora Square back in Alana and attempted to use this trap to trip up Lin Li in the finals. Little had he known that Lin Li's accomplishments and inscriptions were far beyond what he could imagine, and the young mage was able to ruin Darien's carefully planned ploy and take Matthias's life as well with just a small change. The countercurrent vortex worked quite similarly to the change in inscription, which was by using the advantage he had in mental strength to forcefully change the flow of magical elements. If it worked, he would be able to kill almost any of his enemies. Alas, both of these kinds of magic carried fatal flaws. Firstly, it took too long to use arcane combustion as it required too large an amount of mana. Even with Lin Li's technique, he had to recite the spell for at least 20 seconds before switching to a guiding mode immediately. He had to constantly remain in a guiding mode as he could not allow the field of combustion to detach from him, or else, all the mana he had painstakingly released would vanish in a second. The flaw in the countercurrent vortex was even more fatal as using mental strength to forcefully alter the flow of magical elements was already dangerous in itself. It might be alright if his opponent was a magical beast like the Ice Howler if he was accidentally caught in it. However, it could be devastating against a mage as their battle could turn in so many directions at once that even Lin Li was not confident of constantly suppressing his mental strength. He could easily make a long list of flaws, and every single one of them was enough to cost him his life. Well, it was two kinds of newly created magic, after all, and they had too many areas to be improved upon compared to magic that had been passed down and perfected for thousands of years. If the latter was a carefully crafted piece of art, his magic could only be described as the doodling of a child, messy and unrefined, with ridiculous loopholes everywhere. However, it was these ridiculous loopholes that gave the two unlimited potential, as even Lin Li might not know the extent of power they could achieve after repeated improvements and modifications. Lin Li spent the night racking his brains for ideas to improve them, and only drifted off into a deep sleep when the sky started to become bright. Not long after he fell asleep, Lin Li heard Jason's voice from outside the tent. "Are you awake, Mage Felek? What is it?" "I'm here to inform you that we are setting off soon." "Why so early?" Lin Li rubbed his eyes as he peered outside the tent, only to realize that the sun was already shining brightly. No choice, the Dragon Mountains are the Sire Bandits' territory, after all, and after the ruckus we caused fighting the Ice Howler last night, I'm afraid there'll be trouble if the bandits came over. True, Lin Li thought for a bit, and realized that Jason was right. He quickly crawled out of his sleeping bag and put on his robe, only to get a shock when he emerged from his tent. He clearly saw a few dozen people encircling his tent, there were even some familiar faces among them. Norfeller, the priest, the mousy-looking bandit and the young leader. Last but not least, he saw the helpful middle-aged adventurer and the young missus of the Castellan's family. "Are you kidding me, Jason? Care to explain what's going on?" Lin Li's expression darkened as he glanced outside the tent. "Isn't this too much? I only napped a bit and you appear with over 30 people who are nothing but a burden? If I took a longer nap, wouldn't you have called on the entire city of Duland?" Lin Li really wanted to ask Jason if he knew what kind of place they were heading to. They were going to the ruins of Sire Town, the base van score had painstakingly managed for the last 20 years. Even the legendary mage Basil was somewhat wary of it, and you, Jason, want to stroll in with 30 or so people who are nothing but a burden to us? You going to a picnic or something? Well, Jason brushed his nose sheepishly and avoided looking at his grumpy employer as he mumbled while looking down. Leader Sienna is going to the ruins of Sire Town as well, so I thought there would be safety in numbers. If anything happens, we can look out for one another. When he mentioned look out, Jason gave Lin Li a glance, and even though he did not say anything more, his expression and demeanor gave him away. He was trying to say that traveling with the weak and cowardly Lin Li gave him tremendous burden, hence, now that he was presented with a group of men willing to join them for free, of course he jumped at the opportunity to travel with them. Lin Li almost exploded in anger. Of course, he understood what Jason was getting at. He was definitely alright with getting free manpower since he did that often himself, but the problem was, could Jason have better taste when doing that? Do these adventurers look like decent manpower to you? The highest of them all is only level 14, while the lowest barely over level 10. Besides, is Sire Town a place for the missus of the Castellan's family to stroll? It may be one thing for these adventurers to die there, but if the missus died as well, I'd like to see how you're going to answer for it to the Castellan of Roland City. Leader Sienna, you're going to the ruins of Sire Town too? Lin Li finally asked after staring at Sienna for a long while. Honestly, this young man was quite promising indeed, level 14, yet he was only in his 20s, and was the leader of such a big mercenary corps too. If presented with an opportunity, he might well become a distinguished figure in the breezy plains. However, Lin Li was not interested in helping young talents or growing a mercenary corps. He'd only intervened in the battle against the Ice Howler because it threatened his safety as well. He'd never thought of bringing them along to the ruins of Sire Town. This was as ridiculous as a girl holding on to a guy after a one-night stand and crying that she was pregnant with his child. Only Jason would buy this and think himself lucky too. Yes, Sienna was aware that he was not really welcome, and looked somewhat embarrassed as he spoke. You know, Leader Sienna, as far as I know, the ruins of Sire Town are not a peaceful place. Are you sure about going there? Well, Sienna hesitated, but before he could speak, the Castellan's missus anxiously replied, Sienna, you promised me to rescue my brother. Of course, Miss Yvonne, don't worry. Sienna quickly placated the Castellan's missus, and looked at Lin Li again. Well, Mage Velik. Everyone naturally looked at Lin Li following Sienna's question. Everybody had heard from Jason that this cowardly employer had paid 30,000 gold coins to hire them to accompany him to the ruins of Sire Town. Courage and morals aside, he had already paid the money, so of course he was the one to call the shots. It was up to him to decide if the adventurers could tag along with them. Lin Li glanced at him, but did not reply. Instead, he turned to the Castellan's missus. Miss Yvonne, if I'm not wrong, you said yesterday night that your brother was taken by the Sire bandits. Shouldn't you go to the Dragon Mountains if you want to save him? What are you going to Sire Town for? No, I know Cinder is not there, he's at the ruins of Sire Town. Lin Li only wanted to test the waters, and did not expect to receive such a firm reply as the young lady looked him in the eye unwaveringly. How do you know it? Of course I do. Well, Mage Velik, Lin Li wanted to press more, but Jason suddenly coughed at the side. Miss Yvonne and Master Cinder are twins, and have always had a mysterious telepathic connection. Everyone in Roland City knows this. Is that so? Lin Li was shocked. He had heard people talking about the telepathic connection that twins shared. If one was in trouble, the other would be able to feel it immediately. He'd never thought that he would be able to witness it, much less in such a situation. If this was true, Miss Yvonne's value would have to be reconsidered. Bringing her along would be like bringing along an incredibly sensitive radar. They wouldn't even need to search in Sire Town, for all they had to do was go in the direction pointed out by her, and they could easily save the young master. This was much better than searching for a needle in a haystack. All right, Leader Sienna, welcome. Lin Li paused suddenly. But I have to say this first, the ruins of Sire Town are far more dangerous than what you would expect, and even Jason may not be able to fend for himself. You and your adventurers would have to look out for yourselves. Sienna heaved a sigh of relief, and hurriedly assured Lin Li, of course, we will look out for ourselves. How dangerous could mere ruins be? As long as he had Jason and Norfeller when they crossed the Dragon Mountains and left the Sire Bandits' territory, everything would go according to the plan. Sienna had already thought of everything. Once they reached the ruins of Sire Town, he would come up with an excuse to leave and bring Miss Yvonne along so that they could go and rescue her brother. He could not share the credit of rescuing Cinder with the rest for nothing. Lin Li nodded, and it all became easier as they only used 10 minutes to get ready before they set off. He had to admit that it was easier to travel with so many people. It became more convenient to do some things as well since Sienna had over 30 men with him. Other things aside, they had more food and drinks now than when Lin Li and the rest were alone. Even the magical beasts were taken care of by the other adventurers who charged at them and slashed blindly, which usually took care of everything. Hence, Jason and his companions did not even have the chance to step in. Their journey was unusually smooth as they barely ran into any trouble, which allowed them to reach the foot of the Dragon Mountains very quickly. According to Jason, they only had to travel for another hour to reach the perimeters of Sire Town. Lin Li held the ether staff in his hand as he walked at the end of the group, a frown never leaving his face. After passing through a dense forest, they reached an open field, and as they looked from the edges of the forest, they could start to make out the outline of Sire Town. The once prosperous town had been reduced to ruins after 20 years, and all they could see were remnants of it. Even the skies of Sire Town seemed to be filled with gloomy clouds. Most of the adventurers already heard of the tragedy that had happened years ago in Sire Town, and they were all talking about it. Their discussions mainly revolved around how prosperous Sire Town had been, and how many people died back then, but none of them realized that there appeared a faint stench of decay ever since they walked out of the forest. Norfeller and Lin Li seemed to be the first ones to notice that. Norfeller noticed it because it was an all-too familiar smell to him, seeing as he was a high-ranking vampire who had spent 1,000 years in an underground palace where there were countless undead creatures. Lin Li only noticed it because he had always kept Basil's warning in mind, while him saying that he did not dare venture into Sire Town might have been a bit of an exaggeration. The warning hidden in his words was clear. Even a fool would know that the ruins of Sire Town were not as harmless as they seemed. Indeed, the stench of decay carried to them by the wind was no doubt the aura of the undead. Well, thinking of it, thousands had died in the epidemic that happened in Sire Town years ago, and even without any external factors, the grievance of thousands of ghosts would have been sufficient to create a nightmarish monster. Surely it would make sense for some undead creatures to appear after such a tragedy? Bloody hell, an agreement between humans and the undead. Lin Li continued to ponder as he quickened his steps, and the group quickly crossed the field. As they got closer to Sire Town, the death aura became stronger, and even the few weeds on the sides of the barren path looked close to wilting. It was a desolate sight. The sky above the town was gloomy as it was filled with dense gray clouds, and made them feel suffocated even when just standing there. The entire town seemed to be wrapped in a black fog. Lin Li, who had been to both the Shadow Glen and the underground palace, knew that this was because the death aura had solidified. Only a place with a large number of undead creatures would have such dense and intense death aura. That's right, these are the ruins of Sire Town, Sienna said after staring at a map for ages before smiling at Lin Li. Mage Felic, we were lucky to have you along the way, but I'll save my words of thanks for when you guys drop by Roland City. I shall thank you properly then. Of course, Lin Li knew what Sienna was thinking. He wanted to save the Castellan's son once they reached Sire Town, and did not want to share the credit with other people. Honestly, Lin Li would have gladly sent them on their way if they were anybody else, since they would only get in his way and delay their escape. Only, he could not do that now. Well, there was an incredibly accurate radar amongst this group of people who were nothing but a burden. So, Lin Li only laughed, and said, "You're too kind, Leader Sienna, it was only a small matter." Oh, right, I think I heard people mention that there are many undead creatures in this town. I wonder if that's true. Undead creatures? Sienna froze as soon as he heard it, as he glanced around nervously before forcing out a smile. Ha, ha ha, Mage Felix, you're so humorous. Why would there be undead creatures in a pile of ruins? It was just something I heard, you don't have to take it to heart, Lin Li said with a smile, but Norfeller suddenly moved next to him. Norfeller moved so quickly that nobody could react to it, and all they saw was a black shadow, before they heard some noise. Suddenly, a pile of white bones flew over, and a rusty machete coincidentally landed between Lin Li and Sienna. I wonder which bastard made up this rumor. Why would there be undead creatures in Sire Town? Don't worry, Leader Sienna, I'll teach the bastard a lesson when we go back. How dared he make such a rumor, no conscience at all, Lin Li denounced the culprit behind the rumor angrily, and never once turned to look at the skeletal warrior that had been torn apart. Sienna stood with a blank look as he opened his mouth to speak, but was at a loss for words. All he could do was stare at the shadow that was Norfeller as he tore apart the skeletal warriors that sprouted from the ground. The sound of bones cracking continued, making everyone's blood run cold as they stared at the scene in front of them, dumbfounded. Neither Jason nor Sienna had ever seen so many undead creatures at once. They were in the barren fields, in the withered forest, underneath the decayed barrow, and next to a few houses that had collapsed. The skeletal warriors came pouring in from every direction, and all they could see was a sea of eerie white gathering towards them, much like a sea of locusts. Norfeller had turned into a black spirit by now, weaving his way around countless skeletal warriors as he tore them to shreds mercilessly with his sharp claws, making him resemble a scythe-wielding grim reaper. The quietness of the night made the human group short of breath as silence loomed over the world. They stood still as they stared with big eyes and mouths wide agape, and all was silent save for the sound of cracking bones and their own beating hearts. Prepare to fight. It felt like an eternity before Sienna, who almost went into shock from fear, gave a throaty command. Almost at the same time, Jason brandished his rune's adamantine sword, and it glowed blindingly after being infused with a strong dose of combat energy. His fighting techniques remained simple, neither showy nor flamboyant, and even seemed clumsy at times, but it was precisely this that made the explosion of power all the impressive. The rune's adamantine sword was like a fire dragon in Jason's hands, slicing through any skeletal warrior that dared to come near him. Behind Jason, the mousy-looking bandit held a dagger that glittered blue in each hand as he crept silently in the dark, and while he did not fight much, each time he did something, it was at a critical juncture. It could be a lone skeletal warrior that broke through the barrier as Jason fought and endangered the archer and the mage, or maybe Jason made a mistake and his back was made vulnerable to an attack. The priest continuously chanted prayers, and divine magic rained down as a holy light lit up the sky, her face beginning to turn a sickly shade of white due to nerves as well as from her immense concentration. Fight! Fight! You idiots, are you waiting for death? Sienna's voice had turned unusually throaty, and he sounded like he was being choked. Thankfully, the adventurers who had turned pale from fear finally heard the command, and the warriors and archers raised their weapons while the mages started chanting frantically. Well, they did fight an ice howler, and while they were no match for a level 17 monster, dealing with skeletal warriors that were no more than level 5 was a breeze to them, especially with Sienna's throaty commands. The group fell into position as they once again showcased their impeccable teamwork honed from fighting many battles together. The skeletal warriors continued pouring in, and they could only rely on the mages to cause explosions amidst them, causing sparks to fly everywhere. Everyone was in combat mode, except Lin Li. Lin Li stood away from the fight, and while he held the ether staff in his hand, he did not use many magic at all. He looked on like a bystander while everyone was busy fighting the undead creatures. The most perplexing thing of all was that Lin Li kept staring into the distance. Sire Town was not a big place, and he could clearly see a long street from where he stood at the entrance of the town. The street was filled with debris and weeds, evidence that nobody had walked through it in a very long time. Both sides of the street were lined with fallen houses, and skeletal warriors occasionally emerged from gaps between the walls. The only building in sight that seemed in a somewhat good condition was the bell tower of Sire Town. It stood next to the plaza, and while it was only around evening time, the surroundings of the bell tower were eerily dark as though trapped in a thick fog. The eerie bell tower was what caught Lin Li's attention. Lin Li had already sensed a strange magical wave when they neared Sire Town. It was coming from the bell tower. It was filled with the energy of a death aura, similar to the one which Lin Li had experienced in the Shadowglen and the underground palace. Of course, he had also sensed it on the legendary necromancer, Sendros. It seemed that old man Basil was not just scaring him. Huh? The magical wave given off by the bell tower intensified suddenly just as Lin Li lost focus for a moment. It made him feel a little suffocated, as though a large python had suddenly coiled itself tightly around him and was continuously tightening its hold. "We've been discovered." Lin Li came back to his senses immediately. This was a mental blast in its purest form. Lin Li gripped his ether staff tightly, returning fire with a mental blast of his own. In a second, two huge bodies of mental strength made contact in the air. Lin Li thought he heard a cry, but he could not be sure. Thereafter, it all disappeared into nothing. Whether it be the strong force of mental strength or the magical wave that seemed to come from deep within the bell tower, none of it seemed to have existed, as even the fog shrouding the bell tower had disappeared without a trace. What's going on? Lin Li was shocked. While he had a small advantage when the two mental blasts made contact, it was so marginal that even he was not confident in beating his opponent for sure. Why would the other party retreat all of a sudden, then? The whole situation seemed premeditated, as he had won so easily that it was not in the least bit convincing. With that suspicion in his mind, Lin Li's gaze fell upon the battlefield once again. He then realized that something was off with the skeletal warriors as well. They're gone too? Lin Li had not seen wrongly. The skeletal warriors that poured in like a flood had retreated like one too. Just a moment ago, there was barely a spot without a skeletal warrior, but now, not one of them could be seen, and this all happened in a split second too. If not for the pieces of bones that littered the floor, Lin Li would have thought that it was all just a dream, that there wasn't any skeletal warrior or mental blast to begin with. What the heck is this? Sienna held a machete as he stood frozen with a look of shock on his face. He had yet to fully process the events earlier. The presence of undead creatures was already beyond his comprehension as an adventurer, let alone a place covered with them. They're called skeletal warriors, a kind of low-level undead creatures. Lin Li frowned deeply as he answered Sienna's question. He was not surprised by their appearance, since he had already predicted it before entering the town. The only thing he had not thought of was that they would vanish so suddenly. Also, their attack and retreat were terribly well coordinated, much like those of a well-trained troop. This was the nerve-wracking part. Lin Li had been to the Shadowglen and the underground palace. He had even had an encounter with a legendary-level necromancer, so it was only natural that he knew more about undead creatures than Sienna or Jason. Controlling the undead creatures had always been the trickiest issue for necromancers, even for those outstanding ones like Sendros. Well, undead creatures were born from all kinds of negative emotions, and did not have thoughts nor consciousness of their own. They were only guided by these negative emotions to kill and destroy. Necromancers were only able to control them because they had mastered a special way to do so, and not because they could directly communicate with them. Even if one was skilled in necromancy, it would only guarantee that the undead creatures they controlled were more powerful and larger in numbers, instead of having any effect on the undead creatures themselves. This was why there were always large numbers of undead creatures present in fights between necromancers, as they couldn't control these creatures effectively and could only win with numbers. The only thing that could control them was another undead creature, just like the undead lords in the Shadowglen, who were able to easily manipulate every skeleton and corpse there was in that place. They could make these undead creatures their slaves and make them do anything to their heart's content, which was like what Lin Li saw during the War of the Undead Creatures back then. Both armies behaved like proper soldiers, as they were well-trained and followed every order. This isn't going to be fun, Lin Li sighed resignedly. Things would become very complicated if the one controlling them was an undead creature. They were detestable creatures, and since they were born from negative emotions, they remained filled with hatred for the world even if they had surpassed a certain point and gained consciousness and the ability to think on their own. They hated those who were alive, and their desire to destroy everything completely was what kept them going. They were capable of neither communicating nor compromising, and were basically the epitome of stubbornness. The last thing Lin Li could tolerate was a stubborn fellow, as they were completely impossible to negotiate with, and he could only rely on violence to solve any issue. Damn it, I seriously hate using violence. Lin Li cursed angrily, and just as he was going to explain the situation to Jason, the castellan's missus suddenly stood up. I hear my brother, he's there. Where? Lin Li was shocked as his gaze unconsciously followed the direction where the young lady was pointing. What the heck? Lin Li felt a headache coming as soon as he took a glance. The young lady was pointing right at the eerie bell tower. If there was anybody feeling more perplexed by the situation than Lin Li, it would have to be Sienna. Sienna felt his legs turn to jelly at the thought of the thousands of skeletal warriors. He would have left this place as soon as he could, as far away as he could get from these undead creatures. However, he knew very well that not only could he not leave this place, he would have to lead his men into the eerie ruins of the town as well. Well, he did accept Miss Yvonne's payment. That was 50,000 gold coins worth of deposit. She could have easily hired the best adventurer in the whole of Roland City with so much money. When he accepted the mission, he had secretly been celebrating, thinking that he had stumbled upon an easy mission, one that could easily earn him so much money at that. Only now did Sienna know that he had actually stumbled upon something else. He did not know if he would be able to receive the remaining payment of 15,000 gold coins, but the most important question was whether he and his men would make it back alive to Roland City. Damn it, to think that there would be so many undead creatures hiding in the ruins of Sire Town. It would be a most difficult task for him and his men to save someone from this place. He had already witnessed the ability of these skeletal warriors. It was safe to say that they were only slightly trumped by Roland City's army in terms of agility. There were thousands of skeletal warriors, which meant they would have to go against thousands of soldiers. For 30 adventurers to fight against such an army, it was like trying to break a rock with a stone. Sienna looked at the bell tower in the distance, and then at the castellan's missus, who stared at him, and felt a headache coming. Barging in blindly was out of question, since he had no idea what other monsters could be hiding there, and he could not abandon the mission, either, since it was already clearly written in the files that he had accepted Miss Yvonne's payment. If he dared make a run for it, he could bid farewell to his career as an adventurer, since nobody would even hire him for menial tasks in future. Mr. Jason, Sienna could not help looking to Jason for help after much pondering. Can I have a word with you? Honestly, Sienna had no one else to turn to for help. While he and his men were the largest group here, they were no match for Jason and his companions. Jason was a level 15 warrior who was the top adventurer in Duland, and his companions were all level 15 too. A group as strong as theirs would be hard to come by in the breezy plains, not to mention that they had the incredibly powerful Norfeller, who had killed the Ice Howler with his bare hands. Sienna thought that Norfeller was much stronger than Jason, so if he could get their help, they might stand a bit of chance facing their mission after all. Sienna could not be bothered whether he was endangering them by asking for their help, since he was standing at the edge of a cliff himself. How would he have time to care about others? Well, Jason looked around him and at his employer standing in the distance, before nodding his head reluctantly. All right. Everyone was minding their own business after the fight, and nobody noticed the two of them creeping away to the decaying barrow to make a deal. Let me think about it. Sure. Sienna's voice was filled with anxiety and trepidation. Jason frowned as he weighed his options. Frankly speaking, Sienna's offer had very good terms, a reward of 10,000 gold coins in exchange for their help, and it was paid on the spot. Even if the mission was not completed, he would still get to keep the payment, and most importantly, Sienna promised him that he could leave with his companions without regard for Sienna and his men if they met with any unexpected danger. This meant that the 10,000 gold coins were as good as his if he accepted it. There was no reason for him not to accept the offer. Jason hesitated a bit before making a decision. However, he wanted to leave an alternative for himself, and thus did not agree right away. Well, Mr. Sienna, as you can see, Mage Felix makes the decisions in our group. I'll tell him what you proposed, but I cannot guarantee he will accept your offer. Of course, as long as you're willing to speak for us, we would be beyond grateful. While Sienna thanked him, he could not help cursing him in his mind. Damn this hypocrite, Mage Felix makes the decision in our group? Whom are you kidding? He's as cowardly as a mouse. How could he possibly lead adventurers like you and your companions? Besides, all he does is hide away in his tent. Anybody can tell he has no experience with the life of an adventurer. You say he's your employer, but he does nothing at all. Isn't it you who calls the shots? You can fool others with this, but there's no use doing it in front of me. Jason returned to the camping ground nonchalantly, and found Lin Li, who was meditating. Mage Felix, I have something to discuss with you. What is it? Well, you see, Mage Felix, Sienna just told me that they will be heading to the ruins in half an hour to rescue Miss Yvonne's brother, and after thinking about it, I thought that it will be a great chance for us to head inside with the protection of 30 adventurers. Why don't we go in with them, since it will be easier for us with their help? Is that it? Lin Li glanced at Jason cynically. To be honest, he would go in with the mercenary corps even if Jason did not mention it. He had also intended to help them if he could, since he would have future dealings with the Castellan of Roland City anyway. Wouldn't it be awkward for him to face the Castellan's daughter if he didn't help them today? However, this did not mean that Jason could have agreed on his behalf. Sienna and Jason thought that nobody knew they had left. Unfortunately, Jason did not know that when a mage went into a state of meditation, his senses became incredibly sensitive, even more so for someone with almost unlimited mental strength like Lin Li. Once he went into a state of meditation, his strong mental strength would take over his senses. In other words, Lin Li used his mental strength to connect with the world then. In that state, he would become all-knowing, and could even hear the roars of magical beasts in the Dragon Mountains as well as the chanting of spells from the bell tower. Given that he could hear all that, Sienna and Jason sounded as if they had been speaking right next to his ear. It seemed like he had been way too nice these past few days, and now Jason thought he was a pushover. He could tolerate the fact that Jason had decided on his own to travel with the mercenary corps, but for him to accept the 10,000 gold coins as reward in exchange for their safety, Lin Li could not accept that. The only reason he did not lose his temper was because the time was not right yet. He would have to discuss this issue with Jason at another time and place. We can go with them, but, Jason, I have to tell you this, as far as I know, there are hidden dangers in Sire Town, and if you spare too much thought caring for your companions, you may not be able to guarantee your own safety. Alright, Mage Felix, I'll be careful. Jason heaved a sigh of relief after gaining Lin Li's approval. He had the 10,000 gold coins now, what danger could there be? In Jason's eyes, there was nothing more dangerous there than the skeletal warriors, and while he had no idea where they came from, he was not afraid of them. Having fought them previously, he was aware that while he could not exterminate them all, he more than capable of fending them off long enough to guarantee his escape. Furthermore, Sienna had given him his word that he could leave with his companions if they met any danger. Alright then, you can go tell Sienna that we'll leave in half an hour. Half an hour went by in the blink of an eye. The mercenary corps gathered and set off towards the eerie Long Street. It was strange that they had not met a single undead creature after walking for over 10 minutes. They had originally thought that the place would be filled with dangers, but it was unusually quiet, with nothing but the suffocating stench of decay surrounding them. It looked like any other ruins, and Sienna could not help thinking that all the undead creatures in the town had been summoned during the fight, which was why there was none now. Sienna could not help regretting his decision when he thought of this. If he had known earlier, he would not have asked Jason for help. Not only had he lost 10,000 gold coins, he also owed him a big favor, and the worst thing of all was he would have to share the credit of rescuing young Master Cinder if they did manage to do so. As the town square of Sire Town came into view after the group walked through the long street, a swish could be heard coming from one of the precariously shaking houses. Then, a strong stench of decay started spreading nearby, and before Sienna understood what happened, a loud cry could be heard from Jason as the rune's adamantine sword slashed with a blinding light. Whoosh! The strong combat energy from the sword tore open the doors of the house, and before anyone could react, a black puff of smoke rushed into the air, accompanied by a piercing cry. My God! Sienna covered his mouth as his eyes were filled with disbelief. He clearly saw a large bat fly into the sky amidst the fog under the light of the sword. The blurry outline of its body seemed to meld with the fog. It looked terrifying in the dark with its long fangs and blood-red eyes. Jason gripped the rune's adamantine sword in his hand as he stared fixedly at the monster in front of him. He knew it was a true vampire, a level 15 undead creature. Vampires were creatures of the dark, and once they had the cover thereof, even the best of bandits might not be able to detect their whereabouts. Jason felt his heart turn cold when he thought of this. Thankfully, he had heard the sound. If not for that faint sound, he would not have dared imagine what would happen then. If a vampire launched an attack from the dark, even someone as strong as level 17 might not survive it. Of course, that was another matter. After losing the cover of the dark, the vampire was like a fish out of water as it had lost its natural protection. Its strength was no more than an average undead creature's now, and since his companions were all level 15 as well, coupled with the fact that he had the rune's adamantine sword, it was only a matter of time before they killed it. Unfortunately for you, you've got terrible luck. Jason smiled confidently as the rune's adamantine sword shone brightly again. Jason is much too careless. Lin Li paid no heed to the fight that they would surely win. After taking a look at the house that had nearly toppled due to Jason's attack, he hesitated for a while before silently calling over Norfeller. Norfeller, go and settle the rest of the problem for him. Yes. Right, Norfeller, the high-ranking vampire, was just about to leave when Lin Li suddenly recalled something. Are they your kind as well? Not really, they are not pure-blooded, and are merely subsidiary creatures. After giving a rare explanation of more than a couple of words, Norfeller disappeared into a black puff of smoke before Lin Li's eyes. Jason was right. Having lost the protection of the dark, the vampire was not much stronger than any other undead creature at the same level. With the holy light of the priest at their disposal, it was even more suppressed, and Jason was able to wield his rune's adamantine sword with combat energy effortlessly. Furthermore, the mousy-looking bandit who hid in the dark was like a venomous snake as he dealt a lethal blow from the dark. It was only a moment before the level 15 vampire fell under their consecutive blows. Amazing, Mr. Jason is the strongest adventurer in Duland indeed. As Jason tore through the vampire with his sword, Sienna hurried to give his praises. Everybody loved praises, and Jason was no exception. He could not help the smile as he listened to Sienna singing his compliments, and only replied with false humility. You're too kind, Mr. Sienna, I'm just lucky. Haha, Mr. Jason is humble indeed. The two of them were going back and forth before a faint noise came from the house, and Jason turned around shocked before he saw blood splatter. Then, he saw the back-cloaked Norfeller walking out slowly. Jason's face paled. He was drenched in cold sweat as he could clearly see two corpses lying behind Norfeller. The same bodies that looked like they were made out of black fog, the same long fangs and blood-red eyes. Once he saw this, he naturally understood everything. No wonder it had all been such a coincidence, it had been a carefully laid trap. One of the vampires had made a sound to attract their attention, while the other two hid in the dark, waiting to deal a lethal blow when they were engaged in a fight. If Norfeller had not helped them in time, Jason would have become food for the three vampires, yet he was laughing about his luck. Thank you, Mr. Norfeller. Jason thanked him repeatedly with a pale face, but Norfeller seemed not to hear it as he wiped the blood on his nails without any expression and quietly returned to stand behind Lin Li. Jason did not mind Norfeller's indifference, and only smiled before forgetting about his embarrassment. Norfeller had been like this the whole journey, and Jason thought that this was befitting a powerful individual like him anyway. He was able to kill the Ice Howler with his bare hands and kill two vampires in a flash. With such capabilities, nobody would fault him for being cold and proud, for he had good enough reasons to. Or what? Should he smile like a hawker as his useless employer did? The attack of the three vampires had only been a small interlude. The group continued walking to the town square of Sire Town after dealing with them. The Eerie Bell Tower was on the other side of the square. They could clearly see black fog shrouding the bell tower from where they stood. Such strong death aura. Lin Li stood a distance in front of the bell tower as he frowned unconsciously. The intense death aura made him slightly breathless. In his opinion, it was probably stronger than the death aura when he'd encountered the Lich in the Shadow Glen. Just as Lin Li was secretly taken aback, a hoarse voice could be heard coming from within the bell tower. It was not a clear voice, but everybody in the square heard it very well. "Welcome, my guests from afar." As that hoarse voice sounded, a bone-chilling wind spread. The black smoke that filled the surroundings was like black tentacles that swam in the air of the empty public square. The six-pointed star arrays among the black tentacles reflected an ominous flickering glow. Lin Li, a man who was well-versed in inscription and alchemy, naturally recognized it to be an arrangement to activate the six-pointed star array and summon a powerful creature. From that suffocating death aura, the object summoned was likely to be as powerful as the ice howler in the Dragon Mountains. Lin Li gripped on his ether staff and let out a sense of mental strength discreetly while he followed the crowd out. As he walked towards the side of the square, he let this mental strength seep into the six-pointed star array. Damn, Lin Li cursed. He knew he was going to get into trouble the moment the mental strength seeped into the six-pointed star array. The surging death energy within the six-pointed star array had already reached a terrifying height. The death energy engulfed the mental strength before the six-pointed star array system had the time to assimilate the information. It was fortunate that Lin Li was an extraordinary species. If he was a normal man, the loss of this mental strength would have brought irreversible damage to his soul. Because of that, Lin Li did not dare to continue taking such risk. While he stared at the six-pointed star array that was growing brighter and brighter, he held the ether staff horizontally against his chest and made use of the powers of the dragon's eye to create a barrier that could withstand the death aura. Being inside of the protective region, Lin Li could clearly see that while the crowd moved backwards hastily, the entire square had already been filled with black smoke. The glow from the six-pointed star array flickered, and a series of shrieks could be heard. Lin Li knew those cries belonged to the souls that died with resentment. These souls that were under the control of the necromancer were killed with the cruelest methods so that they could remember it eternally. Although they did not have a conscious mind, they had the most primitive ability to bring anything in the world to the abyss of suffering. As the cries of suffering echoed from that black haze, Lin Li could not help but rejoice for his decision to find extra help when he was at Sire Town. At least he had the help from a high-ranking priest. Or else, it would be troublesome. Vengeful spirits were classified as neither imaginary nor real beings. They did not have a physical body, or an actual soul. Attacks physical and magical would both have minimal effects on the vengeful spirits. From the sound of the cries, Lin Li knew there would be at least a few hundreds of them. Even though he was a level 16 archmage, he would not have the ability to get rid of them completely in a short period of time. The only way was to use the theurgy of a priest, the purge spell, to purify these souls that were drowned in suffering and pain. However, while Lin Li was rejoicing, the black haze suddenly started to stir violently, and loud clashing sounds could be heard. To Lin Li's dismay, white humerus fell from the sky out of nowhere. There were skeletal warriors and hell ghouls in the sea of bones. On top of that, Lin Li also noticed 4 liches somewhere near the edge of the six-pointed star array. Screw this. Lin Li cursed in frustration. Now that the matter had escalated into such a mess, no matter how silly Lin Li was, he would have guessed that this six-pointed star array was definitely what Sendros had once mentioned, the legendary Tide of Death. In Sendros' words, the Tide of Death was the most powerful necromagic. It could allow the necromancers to summon all types of undead creatures without any limits until they finished their mana. The scariest thing was that the abilities of the undead creatures would take after whatever necromancer summoned them. This meant that the greater a necromancer was, the mightier the undead creatures he summoned were. For Sendros' skills, he had the true ability to summon a real humorous WYRM. This is really troublesome. Lin Li watched the distance with a daze. He swallowed his saliva with much difficulty. The only thing he could hope for was that the ability of the creature in the bell tower was not as strong, at least not as invincible as Sendros. Otherwise, Lin Li could only be prepared to die if he were to meet a humorous WYRM. The sea of bones in the square stirred amidst the black haze, like surging waves. The vast amount of skeletal warriors trod menacingly towards the group of people with their machetes. Behind the troops of skeletal warriors, there were huge crowds of hell ghouls. They all had ghastly white skeleton staves and a set of glowing will-o'-the-wisp in their eye sockets. A hoarse recitation echoed off as well. Just when Lin Li felt goosebumps on his scalp, there were nearly 10 bats swooping towards them. Bloody hell! It was as though the thousands of skeletal warriors, huge crowds of hell ghouls, and vengeful spirits were not enough. Now that there was an addition of around 10 vampires, would there be death knights ambushing them later? What the fuck is that? Sienna's voice was filled with trepidation. To this adventurer who had never left Roland City, the past 2 days had been too much of a crazy ride. When Sienna took on the mission, he had never expected to encounter the ice howler in the Dragon Mountains or the ruins in the scary public square. That was a true nightmare. Countless undead creatures were like tide water, surging towards them from all directions. The presence of skeletal warriors in such a hazy black environment carried a pungent smell of decay. The numerous skeletal warriors had machetes in their hands. They marched towards them in neat rows like real troops. Their source was an adventurer no more than 30 years of age. He was the fastest runner among everyone. Unfortunately, that did not let him escape the horrifying place, but rather caused himself to be surrounded by at least 10 skeletal warriors. The frantic adventurers were surrounded by the skeletal warriors that only knew how to kill. Shrieks could be heard from afar. Before they could gasp, that unlucky adventurer had already turned into minced meat under that dozen pairs of machetes. Blood splattered all over, staining their white humori crimson. With those phosphorescent lights, these undead creatures emitted a great amount of intimidation and menace. Then, the second and third one followed. In a split second, there were already 10 casualties in the team 30+ men strong. Even Sienna himself could only watch his men dash into the sea of monsters just to be chopped into minced meat. The bloody scene caused Sienna to be stupefied. Step back. Since he had accepted the money from Sienna, Jason took the great responsibility of leading the battle with a sigh. Jason's voice calmed the adventurers down a little. After all, as one of the top adventurers of Duland, his words did weigh in the hearts of people. Under his leadership, the team started to withdraw from the scene. Albeit challenging, the 20-odd survivors managed to retreat to the sides of the square. As long as they could move another several hundred meters, they would be able to leave those freakish ruins. Being faced with such an unprecedented pressure, Jason also exerted his full potential. The energy showed by this top adventurer of Duland could only be described with the word scary. His magnificent sword slew all the skeletal warriors, turning them into pieces, while his raging combat energy could always send the skeletal warriors back to the embrace of hell. His supreme ability allowed him to create a playing field amongst the many skeletal warriors. The adventurers who had been looking at Jason for guidance all the while finally saw a strand of hope. They were all elated. As long as they could return home from this nasty mess, they would pay anything for it. At this time, there was a hoarse voice that sounded from the bell tower. "How is it, my honorable guests? Hope you are pleased with the welcome ceremony." Ha 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 ha. What the fuck? Lin Li glanced at the bell tower from afar and frowned in loath. What a disgusting laughter. Alright, the grand welcome ceremony will stop here. Now, let me discuss some serious things with you. What is it? Sienna asked as he walked out of the crowd boldly. Perhaps it was the voice of the host that gave him a sense of confidence and hopefulness. I have a deal. A deal that would surely benefit all of you. Unlike the anxious Sienna, that voice coming from the bell tower was not frustrated at all. After a spell of hysterical laughter, he continued speaking. That girl in your hands. I'm interested in using her for an experiment. Bring her here and you can leave this place alive. Everyone's gaze was fixed onto the castellan's daughter. After the crude battle, this Missy who came from a noble background seemed to be like any other adventurer now. Her long dress had long been torn in the battle, stained with soil and blood. Her face was pale, and her stare was filled with trepidation that could be found in a fearful little bunny. Anyone that saw her would feel really pitiful. How is it, my noble guests? Time is running out. You'd better make your decision quickly. Do you want to be killed by my pets or hand over the girl? The choice is yours. Sienna knew that the voice's owner was not joking. They really had not much time left. Although the undead creatures around them had calmed down for the time being, that stirring death aura was becoming more and more concentrated. It felt like they would dash up to them and tear them into numerous pieces without warning. He would not be able to bear the consequences of sending Miss Yvonne away, either. She was the only daughter of the Castellan. What if something were to happen to her? Even if he were to reach Roland City alive, there would be a gibbet waiting for him there. Are you hesitating? All right. Let me guess what your concern is. Are you worried that I will break the promise after you hand the person over? Sienna remained silent. His head was bent to look at the soil below his feet. Regarding this point, I actually don't need to explain. You don't have any choice but to believe me. The voice took a pause after saying that. But, since it is the first time we are dealing with each other, let me give you a gift. See that building beside you? There is a secret passageway that would lead you to the Dragon Mountains in it. After you hand the girl over, you can leave this place using it. I knew it. Amongst the group of people, Lin Li might be the only person who was certain that the voice from the bell tower was not lying. There was really a secret passageway from the ruins of Sire Town to the Dragon Mountains. Oh, I understand now. The hoarse laughter now had an additional layer of sarcasm. You are afraid of retribution after handing the girl over to me, aren't you? Ha ha ha. That's very simple. After you hand the girl over to me, I'm going to cast a spell to wipe away the memory of everyone in the ruins of Sire Town. Everything that happened here will become a secret, and nobody will know who handed this girl over to me. Really? This time, Sienna was finally moved as he heard that condition. The conditions the other party gave were indeed very attractive. To leave the ruins alive, and not bear any consequences. Could there be a solution more perfect than this? Instead of the lives of over 20 people, the only thing they had to sacrifice was Miss Yvonne. Think it through and choose wisely. You don't have much time left. The hoarse voice vanished after the reminder. The undead creatures around them were still quiet, like a well-trained military troop that trapped everyone at the corner of the street. Sienna looked at the soil beneath him for quite a while. Nobody knew what he was thinking. After some time, Sienna finally lifted his head. Apologies, Miss Yvonne. Immediately, the surroundings became silent. Everyone looked at Sienna in shock, including Jason and his teammates. The only one who was still himself would be Lin Li. He laughed casually and held his ether staff in his hands. Captain Sienna, are you not afraid of getting into trouble? Mr. Fellick, please do not interfere in something that does not concern you. Sienna brushed the incompetent mage off. His tone was not as polite as before. Then can you tell me, Lin Li said as he shook his head seriously, after you hand his little girl over, whom should I claim my chariot of ice crystal metal from? What ice crystal metal? Ice crystal metal is a type of precious. I can't really explain it in such a short period of time. But, Captain Sienna, the ice crystal metal is not the main point. The crux now is that I want you to stop your plan. You can rebut me, but I will treat all of your words as nonsense. What rights do you have? Sienna asked with hostility. The fella is too cocky. If not for Lin Li's good relationship with Norfeller, Sienna would have dealt with him long ago when he first entered the town. How could he think he could stop these over 20 adventurers from sacrificing Miss Yvonne? Why don't you try me? Lin Li smiled as usual. The only difference was the sense of ridicule and provocation in his gaze. You. Sienna gripped his machete. An ominous glint appeared in his eyes. Mr. Fellick, just when the two men were in a deadlock, Jason pulled on Lin Li's sleeve discreetly. Lin Li frowned and turned to look at Jason. What is it? Asked Lin Li. Jason hesitated before continuing. Mr. Fellick, could you not make things difficult for us? That's a rule for us adventurers. Let's not intervene in how Captain Sienna arranges it for Miss Yvonne. Lin Li pursed his lips. Do you think I feel like interfering? If it was any Tom, Dick, or Harry, I would not care about how Sienna arranges it. The problem is that this little girl is the daughter of the Castellan of Roland City. If I watch her be taken hostage by that dude, it will be too embarrassing to ask her father for the grain I need. That will be worth a whole chariot of ice crystal metal. If those were gold coins, their weight would be enough to kill them. Did that bastard Sienna just said he want to hand Ms. Yvonne over? Has he asked me for my permission? Seeing that his employer did not say anything, Jason casually took it that it was because Lin Li felt threatened by him. He comforted him, saying, "Furthermore, Mr. Fellick, you have heard what the guy in the bell tower said. He just wanted Captain Sienna to hand Miss Yvonne over, and not harm her. Why don't we put this matter aside first and think of a way to save Miss Yvonne after Captain Sienna and his team leave this place safely?" As Jason was engrossed in his speech, he suddenly felt a crossbow's belt's tip being pressed against his chest. Its sharp edge reflected a fluorescent blue light. How would Jason, a man who had been in the adventure industry for all many years, not know that there was potent poison smeared on that crossbow bolt? "And Mr. Fellick, what are you doing?" Jason asked in fear as he broke out in cold sweat. "Cece, can you stop joking?" "Joking?" Lin Li pushed the crossbow in his hands against Jason's chest. The sharp part of the crossbow immediately slitted Jason's clothes. "What else do you mean, then?" "What do I mean? Hee," Lin Li asked smilingly as he added more force to the crossbow. "Jason, tell me the truth. Do I look like a generous man that is easily deceived?" "And no, you don't." "Then, I'm really confused now. Since I don't look like I'm prone to be deceived for my generosity, why do you always treat me as though I am? You toiled so hard to earn the 20,000 gold coins from Sienna, but for the same amount of gold coins you are always plotting to push me into the fire pit. Do you suspect that I will mix sand inside my gold coins?" The moment Lin Li said that, Jason's face was washed white. He did not expect the mage to be aware of the secret deal between him and Sienna already. The mage even knew the exact numbers. "I did not want to mention it at first. Yet, your burning passion for that 20,000 gold coins motivated you to push me into the fire pit. If I don't show you some things, you will really think I'm accusing the innocent." At this time almost everyone's focus was on Lin Li. Apart from Sienna, no one realized that while this young mage was scolding Jason, there was an unnatural distortion at the corner of the street. "This fella is doomed." The sight of the distortion led Sienna to guess that was the mark left behind by bandits who sneaked in the dark. Among over 20 people present, the only bandit who had the ability to enter the darkness instantaneously would naturally be one of Jason's teammates, the level 15 Weather. Of course, knowing was knowing. Sienna was not interested in warning the mage. If he could, he really hoped Jason could get rid of that fella immediately so that he would not create bigger trouble for him in the future. "And Mr. Fellick, please listen to me." Almost immediately, they could see a sword whip out in the dark. What followed was a shriek. Before the people had time to react, they saw a body landing in the middle of the street. How could this be? Sienna gazed at the street in a daze. His eyes were filled with incredulity. How could he believe that Weather, a level 15 bandit, got thrown off by a Lin Li so easily? What a monster. After Weather flew off due to an air bomb, Lin Li did not even look back. He gripped onto the ether staff and gray clouds started to gather above Weather. Instantly, lightning fell from the clouds. The pitiful bandit did not even have time to sit himself up before he got struck by the continuous lightning. His squeals of pain made the previously quiet street noisy again. "God damn it, how could you attack such an honest man like me? Do you even have any morals?" The sudden changes caused everyone to stand rooted to the ground in a daze. They stared as the air bomb exploded and the cloud storm roared. This time, Weather really got into trouble. The sparks, which were like countless golden snakes that slid down, started to burn the unlucky bandit in the blink of an eye. It was fortunate that the female priest reacted promptly. She cast a purge spell and saved Weather's life. However, despite the timely purge spell, Weather was still on the edge of death. His skin was burnt and he was severely wounded. He gave off a pungent stench as he whined in pain. If they did not witness it for themselves, they would not have believed that the fella who was on the verge of death was a level 15 high-ranking bandit. "Mr. Fellick, what do you want?" Jason asked impatiently. The party's partnership in numerous battles had caused them to have a relationship that surpassed that of normal comrades. Now that Weather was suffering from such a serious injury, how could Jason be able to turn a blind eye to it? He did not care about the crossbow put against his chest as he summoned his glowing runes adamantine sword, prepared to fight Lin Li. "What do I want?" Lin Li glanced at him as he repeated Jason's question. "I just wanted to give you a little warning. I hate sneak attacks. The next person who dares to do it will not be as lucky as Weather." Right after he spoke, the ether staff in Lin Li's hand let out a blinding light. Before Jason had the chance to speak, he felt a wave of heat engulfing him. Then, he saw a blazing flame flying towards him. Then, what followed immediately was a POM. A gigantic ball of fire went past Jason's chest. The long flame that trailed behind it was like a blazing sun on a scorching day. Suddenly, it was as though time had slowed down. Everybody held on to their breaths. Their gazes were fixed on that pyroblast that landed in the crowd of skeletal warriors. At once, a gigantic mushroom-shaped cloud shot up the sky. Despite being an earth-shattering spell, the accompanying silence was suffocating. Apart from the sound when the ball of fire exploded, nothing else could be heard. They just saw a dazzling glow of fire spread and engulf the group of skeletal warriors at a crazy speed. Then, the warriors were like snow that melted almost instantaneously. Oh my gosh, Sienna could not believe his eyes. Was that spell really cast by a human? It took himself and 30-plus men, as well as Jason and his 2 level 15 teammates, to kill hundreds of skeletal warriors. Yet, that crazy man had the ability to turn thousands of skeletal warriors into ashes. How could this be done by a human being? Sienna broke out in a cold sweat. He would never have imagined there to be such a powerful man among the team. What a freakish man. No. He should not be described as freakish. This fella is not even human at all. The thought of Lin Li's identity gave Sienna shivers down his spine. Sienna was not the only man who was flabbergasted by Lin Li's pyroblast. Jason gripped onto the rune's adamantine sword. While the combat energy within the sword radiated a blinding glow, Jason's gaze towards Lin Li was filled with trepidation. He could not believe that the young mage whom he thought was an honest and incompetent employer was able to turn the army of skeletal warriors into ashes. Although Jason had his rune's adamantine sword in his hands, he did not dare to move away from Lin Li's cold crossbow bolt that was against his chest. That was because Jason could never be certain of the consequences of doing so. To him, that young mage who had his crossbow against his chest was more threatening than the undead creature inside the bell tower. At once, the atmosphere turned really strange. No one dared to speak. Jason and his teammates and Sienna and his men did not dare to make any move or any sound. They stared at the young mage in fear. Weather seemed to be the calmest of them all. Being seriously wounded, he was already unconscious. Unaware of all the terrifying happenings, he lay on the ground weakly, and his voice could barely be heard. He, this is interesting. How, my guests? It seems that you are having a conflict between yourselves? It was the hideous laughter from the bell tower that broke the tense atmosphere. Underlying the hoarse voice was a sense of sarcasm and gloating. Shut up, moron! Lin Li scolded the other party without turning his head. His eyes scanned the 20-plus adventurers. Now, I'm going to give you 2 choices. 1. To listen to me and not do anything funny. Although there may be some risk, I believe that if nothing accidental were to happen, you will be able to return home alive. 2. You can rely on yourselves. If you are competent with your abilities, you can try to kill your way through these undead creatures. Lin Li paused, and turned to look at the daughter of the Castellan. As for this little girl, I warn you not to have any ill intentions toward her. She is already under the protection of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. Any offensive actions towards her would be a challenge to the guild and also myself." Sienna swallowed his saliva with difficulty. The expression on his face became very ugly. He was not afraid of the Guild of Magic on the Breezy Plains. Since it was something he had never heard of, there was nothing to worry about. But that freakish mage was a serious issue. From how he turned the army of skeletal warriors into ashes in the blink of an eye with a single ball of fire, Sienna knew Lin Li was not a man to be challenged. Not to mention himself, that top adventurer, Jason, would also not have the chance to escape the crossbow against his chest as well. Yet, if he did not hand the daughter of the castellan over, could the over 20 men under him be able to escape the ruins of the Sire town? Sienna hesitated as he gazed at Jason again as though he was seeking for his help. "I will listen to you, Mage Felix." Lin Li would not have expected that Jason would make up his mind so readily. That top adventurer did not even hesitate before he showed his obedience to Lin Li. The moment Lin Li finished his words, Jason dispersed the combat energy on his rune's adamantine sword and knelt down on one of his knees before Lin Li and announced a submissive stance to him. We will take your orders, Mage Felix." Since Jason had made his promise, Sienna had nothing to hesitate about. "Very good," Lin Li smiled in satisfaction. He helped Jason, who had been kneeling on one of his knees, to stand up, and put away the crossbow he had been threatening Jason with. That was a reaction that Lin Li wanted. Although punishing an individual as an example to others might be an overused tactic, it was indeed useful in many circumstances. For instance, the cloud storm that severely injured Weather as well as a pyroblast that slaughtered the army of skeletal warriors caused the two fellas who had ill intentions to become obedient immediately. Lin Li had no other choice either. At the start, when Lin Li had an encounter with the mental strength, he had guessed it a little. Then, the tide of death ascertained Lin Li's suspicion. Lin Li was sure that the creature hidden in the bell tower had to be a real lich, one that had reached the legendary level 20. Being a real undead creature, it might even be more powerful than Sendros, who was just a human being. To Lin Li, level 20 was an unreachable existence. One would never know how the legendary realm was before he entered it. Yet, that level 20 undead creature might still be manageable for Lin Li. He had an object that could resist undead creatures. In another world that he had once battled in, the object was considered the natural enemy of the undead. This object would be able to deal with a level 20 lich easily. However, this thing had a fatal disadvantage to Lin Li now. The force within it was too massive. Lin Li would never be able to really take control over it. Even if he wanted to use a tiny bit of energy, he would need a very long time. How would one have sufficient time to prepare for a battle that was undergoing myriad changes in the twinkling of an eye? Hence, Lin Li had to find a few helpers. Although the few helpers were not very obedient, Lin Li believed that both Sienna and Jason were clever people. It would only take a little trick to let them become more harmonious with each other. Yeah, like they were now. Now, let us see if the legendary tide of death is indeed something that will never dry up, Lin Li said as he raised the ether staff in his hands high up in the sky. Complicated recitation poured out of his mouth like tidewaters. As that obscure recitation sounded, a chilly air started to spread. As the sound of the chanting gradually increased in volume, the huge ice magical element also roared deafeningly in the ruins. The town square that was previously filled with undead creatures was now filled with snow instead. In a flash, the snow covered the sky as it slowly spread throughout the place like a monster swallowing the whole world in an instant. In the face of this doomsday blizzard, the tide of death seemed weaker than usual. The skeletal warriors were trembling in the wind, while the vampires screamed pitifully as they spread their wings in the sky. The liches and vengeful spirits hid in the black fog, refusing to take another step forward. The looming darkness dissipated suddenly, leaving only a gorgeous scene of crystal and snow. My God! Jason could not believe that the one to summon this snow of death was the employer he had thought useless all along, the one who always had a smile on his face and seemed terrified of everything. Not even in his wildest dreams did Jason imagine that this seemingly useless employer would have such capability. To think that he had paid no regard to him the whole time and even wanted to fight him just now. Jason felt himself breaking into sweat at the thought. Sienna was completely shocked as a dull, blank look filled his eyes. He even failed to dodge a flying ice shard, and if not for the quick reflexes of an adventurer standing next to him, who knew what would have happened to his face. That's amazing. The Castellan's missus clenched her small fists as her face was flushed with excitement. Their encounters from the Dragon Mountains to Sire Town had been the most exciting string of events to have happened in her nearly 2 decades of life. Especially after they had entered Sire Town, the young mage named Felix had triumphed over an entire mercenary corps alone and destroyed a troop of undead creatures in a flash. The young mage she had previously called a scaredy cat was now unbelievably powerful in her mind. Lin Li could not be bothered with anything else now, as the 1,000 miles of ice had taken up all his concentration. He was only concerned about distributing and releasing his mana as the torrential ice magical element exploded in the town square, tearing apart countless undead creatures at once while the crystal embedded in the silver shone with gory colors. Time seemed to have lost its meaning now, as everybody was immersed in the ethereal snow. When the last snowflake fell, the undead army that had once covered every inch of land seemed to have evaporated into thin air. There were only a few lingering vampires and hunchbacked liches dragging their bone magic staves around as they stuck their heads out of the black fog to look around, only to find arrows and magic awaiting them. Sienna's men were not stupid, and knew to take advantage of the beaten undead army. Since the young mage had single-handedly wiped out almost the whole army, they knew they should take care of the remaining few. While none of the adventurers were particularly highly skilled, the impact of over 20 people attacking at the same time was by no means weak. It was even more effective against the undead creatures that had been terrified by the 1,000 miles of ice, and it was only a moment before the undead creatures had fallen into a heap. The outcome of the battle had been overturned by Lin Li's 1,000 miles of ice. The adventurers who had previously been on the losing end all fought valiantly now as they easily swept up the remaining undead creatures. While many undead continued to emerge from the dark, they were fewer in numbers and weaker compared to the 1,000 miles of ice previously. The 20 of them fought along the way, and it was only a moment before they closed in on the center of the town square. The successful turn of events gave everyone hope as even the shocked Sienna brandished his machete and joined in fighting the undead creatures. The latter fell one by one, and the adventurers stepped over their bones as they slowly approached the bell tower on the other end of the square. Lin Li was the only one who did not join in the fight, and in fact, he had not done anything to help after releasing the 1,000 miles of ice. He was like a stingy miser now, unwilling to spend the energy to release even a single wind blade. But of course, nobody could fault him for it as after the 1,000 miles of ice, his status had risen from a good-for-nothing fellow to a strong and mysterious mage in the eyes of the adventurers. He had exterminated countless undead creatures with one spell, so why couldn't he rest? If anyone had capabilities like that, they could rest too. Of course, Lin Li was not really resting. Ever since he set his foot in the town square, he had been walking within 6 dots of blood-red light. Strong and pure mana continued to flow into the ether staff as the dragon's eye atop the staff shone blindingly. If anyone looked closer now, they would notice that the 6 dots of light dimmed slightly every time the dragon's eye shone brighter. In the end, they became hidden in the black fog surrounding the area. There were many ways to stop a tide of death, and Lin Li chose the most straightforward method of all. He was using strong and pure mana to forcefully destroy the internal configuration of the tide of death. When the death energy within it lost balance, the legendary level 20 magic would be destroyed as well. Seems like not every lich's powers are as scary as they are made out to be in legends. Lin Li secretly heaved a breath of relief after seeing the last of the blood-red lights disappear. Tide of Death was a strange spell indeed. Its scale was largely tied to the mana of the person wielding it, and, to some extent, could be seen as an extension of one's mana. The stronger the user, the larger the scale of the Tide of Death. Lin Li had chosen to use such a crude method to destroy the Tide of Death simply because he was trying to test the capabilities of the Lich in the tower. From this Tide of Death, he could tell that while the one sitting inside the bell tower was a lich, he was not devastatingly powerful, and as far as Lin Li could tell, both Aldwin and Anduin were much stronger than him. After finding out his opponent's capability, Lin Li became more confident in this rescue quest. He used a gravity spell to trap the vampires flying in the air, before launching arcane missiles consecutively from his ether staff. It was only a moment before the vampires were all shot down. Once the vampires landed on the ground, the blood-hungry adventurers all came running forth with Jason, who held the rune's adamantine sword in his hand, in the front. All the vampires fell under a flurry of slashes, before they even had the chance to put up a fight in a flash. By then, Lin Li had crossed the town square, and gently pushed open the door of the bell tower. The old door creaked as it opened, and an eerie chill hit him straight in the face. It was dark inside the bell tower, and Lin Li could only make out what was inside with a great deal of effort. There was an empty hall upon entering. There were a few tables and chairs scattered around, most of which had decayed due to age, which explained the strong moldy smell. There was a flight of stairs leading up a little further away from the door. Algae covered the steps. From a distance, it looked like a python that had curled up. "Jason, Sienna, bring your men and follow me." Yes. The slimy stairs were narrow and eerie, and while Lin Li had a calm expression as he was climbing up, he could not help feeling slight trepidation. It was the nest of a lich, after all, and after 100 years, the ordinary bell tower was now filled with danger. Lin Li had even thought of some spells to use in case any undead creature decided to attack from the dark. It was worse for the others. The previous fight had already left a deep enough impression on them, as the scene of countless undead creatures surging forth at once was enough to make their skin crawl. Even though a powerful mage was leading the way, who was to say that the mage would be able to look out for them the whole time? Everyone walked carefully, and the short 100 or so meters of stairs took them close to 10 minutes to finish climbing. Then, the 20-odd people froze all at once. There was a room at the end of the stairs, with its door left ajar. Through the crack in the door, they could clearly see that the room was empty save for a short and slim black figure. What is this? Lin Li felt his brain turn blank after seeing the black figure. He had never thought that it would be this easy to meet the lich. They had not met any obstacles along the way, and no danger as well. Besides the annoying algae on the stairs, everything had been as easy as a field trip. It was like a punch falling through into thin air, and took Lin Li by surprise. Just as he was wondering if this was a trap, a hoarse voice could be heard from the room. "Welcome, my guests from afar. To be honest, I'm quite shocked that you made it here. Who exactly are you?" Lin Li frowned as he wondered why he found this short and slim fellow somewhat familiar. "Haha, young mage, be patient, I'll introduce myself later, but first, allow me to introduce my pet to you." "Pet?" Lin Li was taken aback. Then, he heard the growl of a dragon from above him. What is that?" Lin Li was shocked before his expression suddenly changed. "Damn it, a humorous WYRM?" Lin Li was almost scared out of wits. Why hadn't he thought that this guy's pet would turn out to be a humorous WYRM? Damn it, does it have to be so exciting? Isn't this just a simple kidnapping that hadn't been violent at all? Why is there suddenly a humorous WYRM? This was no joke. The humorous WYRM's position amongst undead creatures was not much lower than that of a lich. While a lich was powerful in necromagic, a humorous WYRM represented the highest combat capabilities present among undead creatures. Of course, it was not a real dragon, as undead creatures did not inherit bloodlines. The bones that made up their bodies could be from magical beasts or humans, but one thing for sure was that every humorous WYRM inherited a soul fire dragon crystal. This inherited soul fire dragon crystal was the life source of the humorous WYRM. The scariest part was that the humorous WYRM also gained the knowledge and strength that came with the dragon crystal, and this meant that the strength of the humorous WYRM was not far off from an actual dragon. Damn it, we're in huge trouble. Hee, hope you have a good time together. Just as Lin Li wanted to bang his head against a wall, the lich started chanting hurriedly. Then, a strong magical wave appeared around them. It all happened too quickly, and nobody could react to it. Lin Li had just tightened his grip on the ether staff when the magical wave surged towards them. Then, a strong twisting sensation appeared. It was as if an invisible hand was contorting their bodies, and Lin Li could not respond well enough to it quickly. The only thing he could do was to conjure up a magical barrier to protect himself and the adventurers behind him as it wrapped around them tightly. Luckily, the twisting only lasted for a short while, and stopped just as Lin Li conjured up the magical barrier. He then realized that their surroundings had been defaced. There was no lich and no bell tower, only the dark sky and ghastly white bones. Furthermore, there seemed to be a huge bulky figure rushing down from the dark sky. Fuck! Lin Li raised up his head, only to see a spread-out wing made of bones. It was no doubt the lich's pet. While the humorous WYRM was huge, it moved at an incredible speed. Just as Lin Li looked around, the huge figure had descended on top of their heads as its bone wings swept up a strong wind, making their faces ache as it blew at them. The stench of decay unique to undead creatures started spreading from the humorous WYRM's body, only adding on to the stifling fear everybody felt. Run! As they watched the huge shadow swoop down towards them, Lin Li felt his hair stand on ends. It all happened too quickly, and nobody had the time to prepare for it. The huge shadow had already covered the sky just as the wind started blowing. Thankfully, these adventurers were quite experienced with fights and quickly dispersed just as Lin Li shouted run. Lin Li turned back, and after seeing the last of them at least a few dozen meters away, he heaved a sigh of relief. He then held his ether staff tightly as he allowed the force of the levitation spell to spread around the area as he flew up into the sky like an arrow. The huge shadow gradually became bigger, and the chill cut into his bones as the wind blew right at him, making his face ache. The figure of the humorous WYRM became clearer now. Lin Li could even distinctly see every bone as well as the huge dragon crystal that shone with an icy glow. Then, he heard another growl coming from the sky. Amidst the strong waves of death aura, Lin Li brushed past the humorous WYRM's wing as he flew past it before all he could see was black flames. F***ck, such powerful dragon breath. Lin Li stopped in midair as he looked down and saw the black flame sweep past the ground. Even with Lin Li's capabilities, he could not help feeling shocked at the surging death energy. However, what really made Lin Li's skin crawl was the bones scattered on the ground. They started stirring as the dragon breath swept past them. The scattered bones started to twist around as though the dragon breath had gifted them life and came together like puzzles. Finally, they turned into machete-wielding skeletal warriors right in front of Lin Li's eyes. Oh my god! These words had forced their way out of his throat. Lin Li finally understood what this damn place with the humorous WYRM was as he watched the skeletal warriors stand up one by one. Even the lowest of mage apprentices knew that once a mage surpassed level 20, crossing into the legendary realm, they would have their own magical domain, where the mage could change, ignore, or even create their own rules. It was safe to say that a mage had a nearly terrifying level of control over what happened in their own magical domain, and the stronger the mage was, the more control they had. Lin Li had once heard from Anduin that the god of mages Juresco could single-handedly create a world of his own. Lin Li did not dare imagine what kind of realm that was. He had, however, seen Anduin's magical domain before, as Anduin had once shown it to him in the Sunset Mountains in order for Lin Li to experience such magic for himself. That was a whole different world. Everything there was decided by Anduin. In that world, the wind could stop and rivers could burn. The water could flow upwards and flowers could bloom even when they had already withered. That was a whole different world. Everything there was decided by Anduin. In that world, the wind could stop and rivers could burn, the water could flow upwards and flowers could bloom even when they had already withered. Unfortunately, not many knew that not only legendary mages had their own magical domains. In Anduin's words, magical domains were an extension of one's use of rules. It had nothing to do with intellect nor bloodlines. Even a savage magical beast could have its own magical domain after it mastered enough rules. Take the salamander from the Fire Plume Ridge for example. Its control over the flame energy was an indication of it having its own magical domain. Unfortunately, it had not been able to complete its domain before it had died a wrongful death in Lin Li's hands. Given time, however, Lin Li was sure that it could create its own fire domain. If the salamander could do it, then undead creatures would be no exception. A dragon breath held the power to destroy everything, and it was the same for the humorous WYRM, which represented death. However, the humorous WYRM's dragon breath made the skeletal warriors stand up earlier. How could Lin Li not understand what this meant? If he was right, this was a magical domain. Once created by a lich, in this magical domain, not only could the humorous WYRM's dragon breath destroy everything, it also had the ability to give life to countless undead creatures. Right, this must be the humorous domain Sendros had mentioned. Back in Alana, Lin Li had heard Sendros mention that there were two rules at the core of necromagic, life and death. However, most necromancers only knew of the death energy, while only those who truly understood necromagic knew that life and death were of equal importance. Only they had the chance to take the most crucial step, to step into the abstract and elusive legendary realm. And their magical domains were centered around these two core rules, much like the magical domain in front of them now. Life and death coexisted, and the humorous WYRM's dragon breath that had the power to destroy everything also had the power to give life to undead creatures here. We're in big trouble. Lin Li felt his head throb as he looked at the skeletal warriors that covered the surrounding land. A humorous domain was no child's play, for it strengthened the combat energy of undead creatures endlessly, especially that of the already terrifyingly powerful humorous WYRM. Once it was under the cover of the humorous domain, it would be able to defeat anything beneath legendary level, including the level 17 vampire, Norfeller, as well as himself, who was at level 16. Unless Jason and the rest could get him an opportunity. Wherever the dragon breath swept past, a black flame burned passionately as crowds of skeletal warriors sprung up from the flames like mushrooms. Lin Li silently opened the ring of endless storm as he hovered in the sky and retrieved the cross-sniper crossbow that he had not used in a long while. Jason was on the brink of insanity now, as everything that was happening was far beyond what he was capable of dealing with. He prided himself on being the best adventurer in Dueland, but right now, he found himself unbearably weak as he faced the legendary humorous WYRM. He suddenly realized that he was as good as an ant in front of it, so weak that he was incapable of something as basic as protesting. There were ghastly white skeletal warriors everywhere as they surged towards them in waves. The only thing Jason could do was to channel combat energy with all he was worth and bank on the rune's adamantine sword to help him catch a breather in the midst of the mountains of bones surrounding them. Countless skeletal warriors had been torn to pieces under the attack of the surging combat energy, but more of them rushed forth thereafter. The speed at which they recovered their numbers was devastatingly quick, and as the adventurers looked at the growing numbers of skeletal warriors, even Jason could not help feeling his heart sink. Sienna stood somewhere not far off from him. The blade of his machete had already turned blunt from his constant slashing, but he did not dare relax his nerves. He was clearly aware that he had to persevere in such circumstances as even a moment of slackness could cause him to drown in the midst of the undead creatures. Bloody hell, can that guy really handle this or not? Sienna looked up to the sky once again as he caught his breath in a short moment of rest. This was his third time glancing up. There was a black-cloaked figure hovering silently where he was looking. Ironically, Sienna had never once genuinely worried about this fellow ever since they met in the Dragon Mountains. Well, he was everyone's last hope, and even though he secretly detested this young mage, he had to admit that he was indeed the strongest out of them all. The previous scene in the town square had left a deep enough impression in Sienna's mind, and he even believed that this young mage was perhaps much stronger than Norfeller, who had ripped the ice howler apart with his bare hands. If someone was capable of leading them out of this damned place, it was probably this young mage named Felix. Unfortunately, the young mage was in a sticky situation himself. Sienna could clearly see from where he was standing that the legendary humorous WYRM had spread its massive wings less than 100 meters from where the young mage was. What are we going to do? Sienna panicked slightly as he had seen what the dragon breath was capable of. He knew very well that the humorous WYRM was unbelievably powerful, and even if all of them joined forces, they would still not stand the slightest chance against it. No matter how strong Felix was, there was no way he would be able to go directly against the humorous Wyrm. If something were to happen to him, all 20-odd people including him would probably die here. No way, he had to think of something. Sienna looked at the black figure in the sky, and then at his men around him. After an unimaginably difficult struggle, he finally made a decision even he himself had not thought he would make. All the mages and archers attack the monster in the sky now. What? At least half of his men stared at him with a dumbfounded look. There were skeletal warriors everywhere, and the adventurers were already having a hard time keeping up with the fight. While the archers were having it slightly better since they were only physically tired from pulling their bows, the mages were not even highly skilled to begin with, so how could they cope with exhaustion from constantly using spells? Some of the weaker ones had already started using the recovery potions they had spent a lot of money on, yet Sienna wanted them to attack the monster above them at this crucial point in time? This was complete blasphemy to them. Not only were they too weak to deal any damage to the monster in the sky, even if they were able to, so what? Without the support of mages and archers, the warriors ahead would definitely be attacked from every direction, and once their men were down, the entire team would collapse. By then, they would have fallen to the skeletal warriors everywhere around, much less the humorous Wyrm. Cut the nonsense, if you want to make it back alive, do as I say. The humorous Wyrm had already spread its wings, and the skeletal warriors pouring in from every direction were making Sienna suffocate. He did not have the time to hesitate now, much less explain what he was thinking to his men. The only thing he could do was to shout at them in this rough manner. After Sienna shouted at them, the mages decided to listen to his command instead of bothering too much about it as they retreated one by one, increasing the distance between them and the skeletal warriors. Then, the highs and lows of chanting could be heard from the crowd as the archers abandoned their previous targets to aim at the terrifying monster in the sky. Once the two most powerful teams left the fight, the rest felt the burden on their shoulders increase suddenly as the flow of skeletal warriors pouring in from all directions never seemed to cease. Every time they chopped one into pieces, more would appear in its place. It felt like being trapped in quicksand as the more they struggled, the deeper they seemed to sink. The space they freed up had to be replaced by Sienna as he wielded his blunt machete for all he was worth, exerting all he was capable of as a level 14 warrior. Large beads of sweat continued to fall from his forehead, and he looked drenched like he had just got out of water. After chopping apart a skeletal warrior, Sienna panted heavily as he looked up into the sky again. The black-cloaked young mage was still hovering silently in the air. He had put away his magic staff some time ago, and in its place was a delicate crossbow. In the slot of the crossbow was a razor-sharp bolt, gleaming blindingly. Bloody hell, what's this guy up to? Seeing as the humorous Wyrm had spread its wings and was blowing up huge winds in the air, Sienna felt his heart lodge itself in his throat. He had two paths to pick from now. One was to let his men continue attacking the humorous Wyrm to help buy Felix some time, while the other one was to leave him be and focus on the skeletal warriors pressing in on them. This was a gargantuan decision for Sienna to make, but he did not have a choice. His men were too weak, and even if they were to attack the humorous Wyrm, it would be hard for them to stall it for long. Even a gust of dragon breath would probably be enough to decimate them. But what could he do? The young mage called Felix was already the strongest amongst them all, so if he were to be killed by the humorous Wyrm, then death would surely be the only thing awaiting the rest of them. Sienna quickly made a decision, despite the immense pressure as he landed his machete heavily and sliced an incoming skeletal warrior into two with a crack. At the same time, he turned his head back and, without a second thought, loudly commanded, "Attack." Following Sienna's command, a dozen sharp arrows whizzed into the sky, and strings of chanting could be heard. The vivid magical lights lit up from the middle of the crowd, and the humorous Wyrm's body was covered in a vibrant array of fireworks in a second. Then, an angry growl could be heard from the sky. Hardy as the humorous Wyrm might be, it did not escape unscathed from the sudden attack. A few fireballs exploded consecutively on its wings, bringing away a few bones with them. Meanwhile, the sharp arrows lodged in the cracks of its bones brought it great pain. Of course, what the humorous Wyrm could not tolerate was the provocation brought by these attacks. It had inherited the strength and wisdom of a true dragon along with the pride of one, so how could it allow other creatures to provoke it? These miniature humans who looked like a group of ants, how dared they attack and cause it harm? The adventurers heard a growl coming from the sky. The huge shadow made a sudden turn as it gave up the easy target in front of it and swooped down where the skeletal warriors had gathered without hesitation. Oh no! The adventurers all shared the same thought. The terror that was the humorous Wyrm had long been engraved in their minds, and now that they were facing this horrifying creature, they did not even have it in themselves to try and retaliate. At that moment, everyone was scared out of their wits as they only stared wide-eyed at the looming figure in the sky swooping down towards them. The mages had forgotten their chanting, and the archers had forgotten about pulling their bows, even the warriors surrounded by skeletal warriors had forgotten about the machetes about to fall down on their heads. It only took a moment of shock for cries to be heard from the crowd. Some of the warriors had been shocked out of their minds, and had fallen to the ground under the skeletal warriors' machetes. The deaths of their companions intensified the spreading fear amongst them as the team that had already been unusually separated was now on the brink of collapse. Almost all of them wanted to run for their lives, and the adventurers shoved and jostled each other, making the entire scene chaotic suddenly. Fortunately, Jason and the priest had managed to break free from the skeletal warriors surrounding them by then, and met up with Sienna and the rest. They had only managed to come back from the brink of collapse with the help of Jason's rune's adamantine sword. However, the looming figure above their heads continued to grow, and they could all start to smell the dragon breath. What do we do? Sienna, who was panting heavily, sounded like a broken wind machine. He really felt completely hopeless as he watched the humorous Wyrm fly closer towards them. Perhaps death would drown them all in the next second. He had already done what he could, but the young mage called Felik was still hovering silently in the air as though none of this had anything to do with him. Damn it, he shouldn't have trusted this kid. Sienna cursed in his mind before he looked towards Jason for help. Nobody thought that it would be the priest Rosha, who had not spoken much, coming forth now. She slowly walked out from behind Jason as her delicate face was filled with determination and confidence. But Jason opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something, but stopped suddenly before finally nodding his head. All right. As Rosha slowly walked out, her snowy white robes were being blown around by the wind, making a whipping noise. The melodious chanting of prayers flowed like water as she was covered in a sacred aura under the blinding holy light. Almost everyone held their breaths as they immersed themselves in the earth-shattering beauty. At that moment, everyone had forgotten about the humorous Wyrm in the sky as well as their impending doom. Then, a growl could be heard from the sky. The humorous Wyrm opened its mouth and black flames spewed out of it. At the same time, the priest finished her chant, and in a flash all they could see was a blinding explosion of holy light which seemed to galvanize the world in a layer of gold. Boom! A deafening sound later, the world suddenly quieted down. What's going on? Sienna was the first to return to his senses. He touched his face unconsciously and looked around blankly. At that moment, Sienna thought he was in a dream as he could not believe that he was still alive after the dragon breath attack. But everything around him seemed much too real. All 20-odd of his men, and not one less, were staring at him in confusion. The crowds of skeletal warriors, however, seemed to have disappeared into thin air, making the world much too empty. Besides the mage and the humorous Wyrm in the air, all that was left were the confused faces of the adventurers. Oh, no. There was also the pale-faced priest, who had fallen into a heap on the floor. Her pale face was void of any color, and Sienna could not detect any more divine power from her, not even a trace of life, actually. If not for her weak breathing, he would have thought she was dead. Sienna then looked at the grieving Jason, and suddenly understood everything. The priest had used a theurgy that required a large sacrifice. Only such theurgy would save them from the dragon breath and allow them to survive, but the priest would have to pay a large price. Thank you. Sienna's voice was soft, but even a deaf person would be able to tell that it came from the bottom of his heart. Lin Li continued to hover silently in the sky, and his posture had not changed at all. It was as if nothing in the world had anything to do with him besides the cross-sniper crossbow in his hands. Time was of utmost importance to him right now, as he was releasing mana with all his might. Only when he released all the mana would he have a chance to use the holy light from the meteorite debris. Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.